Hey guys, Matt here today, getting back into Hebrews 3 and 4, the subject of God's rest. Last time we talked about two questions. We did Hebrews 3, 7 through 13 or 14, and we didn't get to the third question, which we'll get to today. But question number one was, what's the worst sin imaginable? What's the worst sin anyone can commit? And we talked about how your mind might conjure up things, terrible things, like child molestation or rape or murder or you name it. Go on and on and on. And those, while they're terrible things, the worst sin ever on the top of the list is unbelief. In fact, speaking of belief, one of the other questions was, how are the Jews saved? How are they saved compared to how we're saved? And we looked at the fact that no, they weren't saved by animal sacrifices. No, they were saved by faith, right? Abram believed and it was accounted to him as righteousness, Genesis 15:6. The same thing is with us. It's always been about faith. So here's what the author says. He says, guys, why are you going back? Don't let the Judaizers pull you back into keeping the law and animal sacrifices and temple worship. After all, don't you remember? Don't you remember what happened to your ancestors in the desert? Guys, they had hard hearts. They were rebels. They put God to the test. They had evil, unbelieving hearts. Does that sound like someone who's saved? Of course not. In fact, God said himself, that whole generation provoked me. They always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. God sends a whole generation of Jews die apart from God. It's terrible. Remember Numbers 14. Everyone 20 years and older died, and guys, they went to hell. Just like the unbelieving, rebellious Jews in Hosea 1 through 9, chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, God divorces them. It's terrible. People say, but didn't they have a covenant relationship with God? No, God had a covenant with them, but they didn't keep it. It wasn't God who broke it, it was the Jews. Just like if a man had a wife and she continually, after being warned over and over, continually committed adultery, eventually he'd have to divorce her if he was a good husband. And God is a good husband. So the author says, guys, don't be like them. Don't consider Jesus. Don't go back to that. That system is not for today. Today's a different day. Today, if you hear his voice, enter his rest. So what is rest? Clearly, rest is salvation. If he says, don't be like those unbelieving, evil people in the desert, what happens to people that are considered evil and unbelieving? They don't go to heaven. They go to hell. I've heard people teach that if you're a rebellious Christian, God might cut your life short as punishment. And think of the absurdity of that comment. God's going to punish you by taking you to heaven to be with him? Of course not. No. You hear this with John 15. Well, the people that are being cut off are being lifted up so they can bear. No. There's never been a middle road, ever. It's always been about belief and unbelief, blessing and cursing, a narrow gate and a broad way. Right? Think of Noah. Noah and the 8 people that were saved along with Noah, they represent the narrow gate. Everyone else, the broad way. Think of the Jews in this passage right here. Right? They represent the broad way to destruction. Caleb and Joshua, they represent the narrow gate. And the author here is saying, guys, here's what's happening. You're being tempted. You're being persecuted. You're being tested. However you want to look at it. This reeks of Matthew 13, right? They received the seed with joy, but persecution came because of the word. And now we're going to find out if they're really saved. In fact, Matthew 13, that's going to come into play in chapter 6 here too. Here's what's going on. The author's saying, guys, we're going to find out who's really in Christ and who's not. I warn you, consider Jesus. Don't be like the Jews who didn't believe. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Today, as long as it is called today, don't harden your heart by the deceitfulness of sin. Exhort one another, build one another up, consider Jesus. Don't forget about the gospel, right? We have come to share in Christ if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end. You got to hold on to it. If you're really in Him, you'll hold on, right? Chapter 4, verse 2. For the good news came to us just as it came to them. But the message they heard didn't benefit them. That means they weren't saved, right? The message didn't benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listen. For we who have believed, enter that rest. As He has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not. He's dividing them right now. He's saying those that don't believe are just going to be like the Jews in the desert who died and unfortunately went to hell. Just like the Jews in Hosea chapter 1, 1 through 9, a whole generation died apart from God. Don't be like them. Now he goes on here and he keeps mentioning this word today. He goes on, he says, since therefore it remains for some to enter His rest, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter it, again he points a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterwards in the words already quoted, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. Today is the day of salvation. You remember hearing that? It's all about today. For somewhere, the author says, for somewhere He has spoken of a seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all His works. Right? What's he getting at? This is building up to something. Verse 8 of chapter 4. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from His works, as God did from His. Okay. So what is God's rest? Well, God's rest is salvation. When do we get it? We get it today. Enter it today. What of this talk of the Sabbath? What's that all about? Well, it's interesting. Today there's a great push to, you hear people say, get in touch with your Hebraic roots. You hear that all the time. People flying the flag of Israel, right? Keeping the Sabbath on the true Sabbath, Saturday, being more holy, right? No, that's not what he's saying. That's not what it means. It's a new day, right? Today is the day of salvation. Why would we want to go back? What happened to the Jews who didn't keep the Sabbath? What happened to them? Well, let's just look here. You can look a couple different places. Exodus 31, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the generations as a covenant. Who are the people of Israel? Is there anyone who's born again? What was God saying with the Sabbath? It was a type and a shadow, right? It was a small, small type pointing to a big, big Jesus. When you hear people going back and pretending to be Jewish and keeping trying to keep these holy days and Sabbaths and eating certain foods and saying G-D and dressing, you don't need to do that. That's what the author's saying here. God said, you can't work on the Sabbath. You must not work. What does it mean? You can't work for salvation. That's what it means. And when Jesus came, He said, today, if you hear my voice, enter my rest. That's what it means. Today is the day of salvation. Today is the Sabbath. When is the Sabbath? It's today. The Jews kept it on Saturday. The first century church, they kept it. They called it the Lord's Day. They kept it in Acts 20 verse 7. They kept it on Sunday. They called it the Lord's Day. Were they breaking this? No, they weren't breaking the Sabbath. They knew it was a new day. Why did Jesus heal all the time on the Sabbath? John 5, John 8. He's saying, guys, I'm here. It's over. I've arrived. I am the Sabbath rest. Enter me today. If you hear my voice, don't harden your heart. When's the Sabbath? It's Wednesday. It's Thursday. It's Friday. It's every day. It's today. If I see you tomorrow, what am I going to say to you? I'm going to walk up to you and I'm going to say, how are you today? It's always today. Today's the day to enter his rest, right? So when we hear people going back and teaching how important it is to keep the Sabbath, yes, it's incredibly important, but it's every day. Don't let people drag you under some yoke that you have to keep the Sabbath. I have a very dear friend of mine who he's a pastor of a church, and another pastor in his general region got convinced by one of these modern day Judaizers that their church had to keep the true Sabbath on Saturday and not work, and all of this nonsense going backwards. And you know what happened? The church fell apart. The church split. Because when people go back and try to go back to that stuff, it's kind of like the Hebrew church, isn't it? No, we don't look back because those were types and shadows. Jesus is bigger. People that go back make Jesus smaller. What Paul was trying to say in Romans 14 is, okay, if you think you have to keep it on a certain day, okay, do it. But don't try to push it on other people. If you think you have to eat certain foods, okay, eat them. But by the way, those who think they have to keep the Sabbath on a certain day or have to eat certain foods, they are of less faith. Everything is, rise, Peter, kill and eat, right? It's a new day, right? It's the Sabbath today. Today, if you hear his voice, enter his rest. Why would we want to go back to something that nobody could ever keep, that was punishable by death, when we could enter his rest? His yoke is easy, his burden is light. The Sabbath is all about today. So today is the day of salvation. Today is your Sabbath rest. Is it a good idea to take a day and set it aside for God? Absolutely great idea. But the Sabbath isn't something that must be done on Saturday. It should be done every single day. And it's done by faith. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Enter his rest. Because you might not have tomorrow. You might die today. Do you know him? Are you truly in faith in Jesus Christ? Are you truly born again? If you are, keep going. Enter his rest. It's a beautiful thing. Stay there. Keep obeying the gospel. Keep abiding in Christ. And if you're not, ask him to save you. Ask him to open your eyes. Do it today. Today is the day of salvation. Peace.